Hey guys, Naz here, how's it going? Today I'm going to be showing you how I did all the airbrushing for Ignitus here. You can see that he has an absolute ton of airbrushing on him, so I'm going to be taking you through how I did that. You've probably noticed that this video is very long. I filmed most of it on my GoPro camera and I found that if I sped it up too fast it was just a blur, it was impossible to follow. So instead of talking through the entire video, what I'm going to do is talk over key points as I start an area of airbrushing, and when I'm talking I'll have this little audio icon in the bottom right hand corner. So if you want to skip along, if an hour of airbrushing goodness is too long for you, you can skip along and you'll still get the explanation of what I'm doing in each portion. So to start off with, Ignitus is made from Minky fabric, just Shannon brand Minky fabric, and I started making him in a very pale orange, and his wings and spikes etc. was sort of a dark fuchsia colour, which I then airbrushed into more of a reddy pink kind of colour. The kind of fabric paint that I use is the Createx line of airbrush paints. I find that this works really nicely on Minky. Obviously when you're airbrushing to this degree, the plush isn't going to be as soft as it would be if it had no airbrushing on it. I wouldn't say that it is an unpleasant texture, it's just a little bit more stiff than if it was not airbrushed, but I would still say that it is quite soft. So what I needed to do before I started airbrushing was I was going to airbrush the orange first. So I went and got some masking tape and I masked off every single area that I didn't want airbrush paint to get on. I find that when I'm doing airbrushing, if you do a lot of masking beforehand, it saves you a lot of trouble with paint potentially getting somewhere you don't want it to be. So I made Ignitus's wings first before I actually made his body, because I was waiting on the custom printed fabric from Spoonflower for his spikes. So here I am airbrushing the interior sort of fingers in his wings, and all I've done is I've sewn them and I've actually pinned them to some cardboard here. That's just so that when I'm airbrushing and drying them they're not going to blow anywhere. So I've pre-mixed my paint and I've airbrushed that onto some test pieces of fabric to make sure that I like how the colour comes out, making sure that you see how it looks when it dries, because if your colour is too pale it might just be way too pale when it dries, you might not even see it. So I'm just going in here and with a reddish pinkish colour I'm just airbrushing the outsides of each of the wing bones, and after each layer I'm going through with my hairdryer and I'm just drying them to make sure that they're nice and set. So I go in and every time I get a little bit too much paint on, if your colours are fairly similar, you can go in with a little bit of toilet paper or paper towel and you can just wipe away a little bit of that excess paint. If you're working on, say if you're airbrushing blue on white and you want that white to stay pure white, that won't really work, just because the pigment is going to smear a little bit when you rub it off with the paper. I'm just, all this airbrushing I'm doing, I have my references open in front of me and I'm looking at where the shadows are on each of these pieces. So I'm going here in here again and I'm using the paler colour first. You usually want to use your palest colour and then work up to the darker colours. If you go in straight with a dark colour it can look kind of smudgy and not look too fantastic. So I used that medium pinkish red and then I went in with that burgundy. So here you can see I'm starting to airbrush Ignitus. I think most of this coat was just airbrushing water onto him, and that's something I do when I'm airbrushing these large plush. Because Minky has a nap, so it's a very short fake fur, if you don't have the water on there sort of holding the fibres down, the fur is just going to blow in every which direction as soon as you apply air and paint on it. So I like to go in before I start any airbrushing and just do a very light coat of water and smooth it out, and that keeps the Minky from blowing everywhere and sort of ruining your neat flat look of your airbrushing. You can see on Ignitus all the masking that I've done beforehand. I've done his toes, all of his spikes. I've made sure extremely well to cover his eyes and his horns. Pretty much everything that I don't want to be orange I have masked off. You can see that I've actually masked off all of his embroidery, all of his markings on his body. That was extremely tedious because they are all embroidered with gradients on them. I didn't want any orange to get on them. I wanted them to stay pure, sort of that fuchsia red kind of colour. So in order to mask all of those off, I laid clear tape sort of packing tape over the top of each marking, and I drew with a little Sharpie marker the shape of the outline of that marking. I would then remove the piece of tape, and then I would cut out that, cut it out on the lines that I drew, and then re-stick that onto each individual marking. So that probably took nearly an entire day to do just the masking for all his patterning. That usually wouldn't be a problem, but yeah, that colour, I didn't want it to have any orange on it, and he has quite a lot of markings. So I mixed up my medium tone orange that I wanted. This is going to be the lightest colour that I airbrush on top of him. And I'm just going in through here and just doing quite broad strokes, making sure not to get in too close. I want to get him, he's way too pale orange. I make sure that the fabric is the palest colour that you want in your airbrush sort of palette. So I did him in a very pale orange, which will eventually be the highlight colour. So here I'm going in with the mid-tone and just doing broadly airbrushing in all the shadows and doing a bit of airbrush just all over him essentially to darken his overall colour, but still leaving a bit of those pale orange highlights from the original Minky colour. You want to make sure that you have some sort of ventilation going in your room because this paint can get quite stinky. I did have to shut my curtain for this, but I did have a fan blowing the paint away from me. But if you can do this by an open window or an open door, or even outside, that'll be even better. So you don't want to be breathing in a whole lot of that paint. So between each of the layers, I'm going to go in with my hairdryer and I'm going to just dry him off very thoroughly. You don't want to be putting too many layers of paint on top of each other. That's when your airbrush job starts to get a bit crispy and not very pleasant to touch. So at this stage I'm going in and I'm doing a bit more just general airbrushing, and I'm also going in and I'm darkening those areas that I want specifically shadowed. So usually I do each side of the hips, sort of around the shoulder, and then anywhere else that my reference material shows shadow in. So I also went in here, you can see that I'm sort of drawing his bicep. He has quite muscular arms, so I'm just highlighting those shapes with the airbrush. You can sort of think of airbrushing in this way as like contouring on a face. So you're putting down light and dark colours of makeup and then blending them to sort of enhance features and potentially give sort of additional volume where it might not have been in the first place. So you can see I give him quite a muscular look to his arm. There was a fair bit of muscle, there was a fair bit of bulge in the patterning, but I just enhanced that as much as possible. Here I am going through airbrushing between each of the toes just to make them look like they're a bit of a deeper recess into his foot. You can see that I've used sewing pins to pin down all along the centerpiece where his chest is going to be sort of that golden brown colour. I definitely don't want any orange to be getting in there, so I really made sure to make sure that masking tape wasn't going to peel up. So I like to put pins in every couple of centimetres just to make sure that no paint is going to get underneath there. You can see on him I've got some spots of masking tape, and those are just for like little scale patterns. I did more of this on Spyro and Cinder because they seem to have more scales in their texturing. Ignitus only seems to have a few scales here and there, but I just put them randomly on there, and you'll see later on that I will airbrush on top of them. So I will sort of give like a little shadow around them, and then I will dry that off, then peel off the masking tape scales and then airbrush on top, so you have like a nice little shaded scale there. And I tried not to do too many layers on that, so it was nice and subtle. So here I am going in and doing the first airbrushing on the face, really following my reference here. My chair doesn't have any wheels left on it. I really need a new chair, so that was me just shimmying up closer to him. Really being careful not to go too heavy on the face. I'm sort of outlining all of his features just to make them pop a little bit more, so you can see that I'm outlining the ridge of his nose, I'm doing his nostrils, I'm doing between pretty much all the seams, and I also intensified how deep his mouth looked by airbrushing along his mouth there. The face is the most important part of most of your airbrushing jobs. You really want to make sure that you do a really nice, neat job on the face, because that's what people are going to be looking at the most. So I'm making sure to really dry between every single layer. I don't want there to be any chance of me smudging the paint with my hand as I'm airbrushing other little bits and pieces, because he has quite a lot of little features on his face. I was having to sort of get right in there, and I didn't want to accidentally bump anything. So once I've done this initial layer of airbrushing, I was going to mix another batch of paint. I think I pre-mixed it before I started, but I started adding some brown to that orange paint. I was having a bit of problem with my paint not being thin enough during this airbrushing session. I really got a bit impatient. I really should have thinned the paint down a little bit more. And I wouldn't have had so much trouble, but I did get there in the end. I wasn't so stubborn, and I did thin it out a little bit. So I made the second batch of paint a little bit darker. While this orange looks quite bright that I've just airbrushed on, that's going to dry much, much paler than it looks like when you first lay it down. So you want to keep in mind that you're not really going to see the true colours until it's fully dried. I'd say even until the very next day you're not going to see the final colours that the plush is going to turn out like, because it really needs that time to dry. Here's some good footage of me putting in his he has like these rib cage shadowing. I'm just going in and putting lots of thin layers and trying not to keep my airbrush in one spot for too long. Going in and just doing more contouring around his legs. I think I go in soon and I do the muscles on his legs as well, just to make him look like he's got some musculature there, whereas the pattern is just more of a flat shape. You can also see that I've contoured underneath his tail, and I'm going to go ahead and do the same on his toes like I did on the front. I also go in and draw a bit of a knee in there. Just follow your reference as much as possible, and don't go in too heavy too quickly. Just try and put in a light layer at first, and then you can deepen it a little bit as you go. I'll leave you guys to watch the rest of me laying this orange down, and I'll come back and have a bit of a chat when I'm on the next layer. If you want to skip ahead to some more narration, just look for when the little audio icon pops up again in the bottom right hand corner. So my first layer is relatively dry. I'm going to go ahead and start going in with a bit of a darker orange. So I think I just intensified the saturation of that orange, put a little bit more into the paint, and I also added a couple of drops of sort of like a burnt umber, sort of a nice warm brown colour. You really want to make sure that you test all your colours beforehand, because there's really no going back if you put a very wrong colour onto your fabric, apart from trying to wipe it away immediately and get as much off with your paper towel or toilet paper as possible. So I'm just going in here, and you can see that my first layer has really given me a guideline for where all those shadows and those sort of muscle groups are going to be. So I'm just going in with a darker colour and trying not to be as general as I was the first time, being a little bit more specific and going into the deeper shadows with the deeper colour. You can see that his colour's changed a lot overall. He's turned from sort of that pale golden sort of buttery orange colour to definitely more of an orange. So I'm just going in here and applying the darker colour where I feel it needs it. And then the next step will be adding an even darker colour. I think I did about 3 different tones, or maybe 4 on him. So the first initial pale orange, then a darker orange here, and then I was almost airbrushing with brown for the deepest parts of the shadows. As I said earlier, you wouldn't want to go in with that brown straight away. It's going to look very muddy and smudgy, so you sort of want to build from your lighter colours to your darker colours. You can see here I'm adding a little bit of this brown paint to the mix that I'm already using. You can see on the left those couple of cups, those are the 2 oranges that I've already mixed. So for the darker shadows I don't need too much paint, I just need a little bit of this orangey brown, and you can see that I'm just testing it on a piece of white felt to see sort of what colour it really sprays out like. And here I'm just going into the darkest colours. I wanted it to be a little bit darker, so I added a bit more brown. I'm just going into the darkest shadows and just adding a tiny bit of this brown. You really want to be careful when you're adding your darkest colours, because I guess they're the biggest risk. You know, if you make a mistake, they're going to be the most obvious because they're going to contrast the most. You can see here I'm just pushing the minky fabric down. If it dries out a bit, sometimes it can sort of fluff up and blow around a bit. So once you've done your first initial water pass and then you've gone over with your general colour, usually it won't move around too much. So you can see here I'm just going behind his eyes to really make those pop. Then I should go in the heaviest muscle areas, so sort of the muscle, what would you call them, like the tendons on his neck. I'm going in and just darkening the darkest shadows in those areas. So once I've done that, I'm just mixing my paint thoroughly here. I'd just go around the whole plush and do essentially the same thing as I have been doing before, just putting small amounts of paint in those darkest shadows. So now all my orange airbrushing is done, and I'm going to start tackling all the sort of brown gold colours on him. So what I'm going to do is once I've made sure that he's totally dry, gone over him a couple of times with my hairdryer, I've peeled off all the masking tape on the areas that I do want to paint, so you can see the horns and the belly are now exposed. I'm not too worried about getting brown onto the existing orange. I was more worried about getting orange onto sort of that creamy brown that his horns and belly are. The brown won't be too obvious if I accidentally get a little bit of overspray spraying the brown onto the orange, because the shadows on the orange are already that browny kind of colour. So you can see here I'm just using my hand to block behind it to make sure that I don't get too much overspray onto the orange. And essentially with the horns, I'm really just going in and doing where all the shadows would be, just doing some gradients, going in and sort of making them look like they're more recessed in those seam areas and those overlaying areas. So really you're just going in where all the shadows would be. After I've gone in and done all of that, I think I went and made sure that I did the backs as well, and I went in and Ignitus has sort of like a wood grain effect to his horns, so I went in very close with a very sharp and fine spray, and I did some sort of little lines on his horns, and going in really close with that sharp thin jet of air that sort of pushed the minky aside and actually gave a really nice little recessed look, sort of like wood grain. So I just went and did that to match the reference, so going really quickly, really close, in vertical little stripes up and down, making sure not to dwell too long at any one point to make sure that they're sort of organic looking. So now I'm going to move on to his belly, and I'm using the same brown colour. I like to do the edges first, So I'm going in where all the embroidery is and just trying to blend that brown embroidery in with that sort of creamy colour for his belly. So I'm just going to go in with a couple of layers, going all around the outside and just sort of trying to blend that sharp line into more of a soft brown line that follows, sort of breaks up where his orange meets that brown cream look on his belly. And after that I'm going to go through and pretty much airbrush over all the brown embroidery that he has on his belly, making it look a bit more natural, blending it in more and making all those cracks look like they are actual cracks and not just drawn lines on him, give them a little bit of shadow here and there. You can see that I'm also adding some of my own lines where I think it looks more natural. If I was to make him again, I think I would probably do more of the lines with just airbrushing rather than doing the embroidery. Having that very dark brown in the embroidery definitely makes it look like the cracks are deeper, but I found it a little bit difficult to get them to blend. So I think next time I would probably only do the lines for the outside as well as the horizontal bands and leave more of the detailing to the airbrushing. But it really depends on what colour you're going for, how dark and how light your colours you're working with are. So part of this is just experience. You know, I think every time I do an airbrushing job there's always something that I could probably do better and that I'll probably try and improve on next time. Usually though, if you make sure that the areas you don't want to have paint on them are really thoroughly masked, I don't mess up so much that I have to redo anything. If I accidentally got a splatter of paint somewhere, I can usually get in pretty quickly with some toilet paper or some paper towels and wipe as much of that away as possible. It would be a lot more difficult if you were doing work on a character with much more contrast, if you were airbrushing say dark blue onto white. I generally recommend that you don't airbrush really dark colours on really light colours too often. Usually it's not going to look super natural. You sort of want to be doing more natural blending and shadows in similar colours to your original based Minky fabric. I wouldn't recommend doing, for example, black stripes on a white plush because you're not going to get a perfectly smooth finish. You can see here that I've added a little bit too much brown for my liking, so I'm just going in with a roll of toilet paper that I have just for airbrushing and just wiping away a bit of that excess paint. But it will, again, as I said earlier, it will lighten out as it dries. But really, less is more. You really don't want to put too many layers down to start with. You just want to put the minimum amount on, dry it, see how it looks, walk away from it for a little bit, just so that you don't get too trigger happy with your airbrushing, which is something that I'm definitely guilty of. So here I'm contouring his belly plates, if that's what you would call them, just adding shadow around the sides and shadow closer to where they sort of overlap each other. And once I've done that, I'm going to dry it off and I might go in with a little bit of a darker colour just for the more shadowy recessed areas. So now all my airbrushing is essentially done, and I'm going to remove the tape from the areas that I wanted to be protected, so all of his spikes. You can see his spikes here have these nice gradients on them between sort of red, fuchsia, burgundy and yellow. And I had these custom printed on Minky fabric from Spoonflower. Now when I sewed them up, because the colours are quite dark, you could see a fair bit of the white showing from underneath, because the printed Minky from Spoonflower, they only print on the surface, so with darker colours you can see a bit of the white coming from underneath. So what I did was I went in and airbrushed more of that sort of pinky red colour on top of the areas that were showing a bit too much white. You can see here that I'm just manually going and picking off all the little masking areas that I did for his embroidery, and I really didn't have any bleeding, any orange colour going in and getting on those embroidered areas, so I was really happy with that. If you were doing white embroidery that you were airbrushing around, for example, most of the time the eyes, that is going to be a lot trickier because it's going to be a lot more noticeable if you have bleeding underneath it, but you can go in with some acrylic paint and just touch up any areas that might accidentally get some colour on them that weren't supposed to. But I'm just going to go and pick off all the rest of the tape, which was pretty satisfying to do, and I'm going to free up all of his spikes, and then at a later time I assembled his wings, wired those, attached them, and all I did was airbrush some more orange where his wing, where his shoulder met sort of where his wing attached, just so that that orange blended in nicely. And that was essentially all the airbrushing that I did for him. It was very handy having his wire for his wings already in his body, because I could just pick him up via the wire rather than touching the plush too much. But you can see all sort of the contouring, all the muscle that I've airbrushed in there. And again, that's just paying close attention to your reference. There is only so much detail that you can put in there with the airbrushing, but I find if you're trying to give the look of muscle or scales, airbrushing is a really good way to do that. Airbrush plush are definitely more for display, they're not for playing around with. I definitely wouldn't be giving an airbrush plush to a kid. If you sweat or if you get them very wet, it could potentially ruin the airbrush job on them. So definitely more something for a display piece than for something that's going to be cuddled or mucked around with too much. You can see here a nice close-up of all the sort of wood grain look on his horns, and I free the rest of him from his masking tape prison, and you can see in a second what he looked like when he was all finished. So here we have the finished ignitus with his wings all attached. The webbing on his wings was ordered from Spoonflower and printed on Spoonflower Minky. I probably could have done that airbrush job myself, but it was just such large pieces and so much work. I actually figured that it would be easier to get it printed with Spoonflower. I didn't have too much problem with the white showing through on the sort of golden brown colours on his wings, but I did go in and airbrush some areas just to give it a little bit more darkness in sort of those chocolatey shadowy areas, and I also went in and airbrushed a bit more yellow and orange just in very light layers to give them a bit more variety. So you can see here all his finished colours. You can see that there's not too much white showing through the printed spine areas because I went in, as I mentioned, and airbrushed the colour on top of them. So that's one option if you're looking at getting a dark colour printed through Spoonflower. I had to get these printed because I couldn't do a yellow to that fuchsia red colour gradient, because what would have happened if I had, say, used a yellow base colour, any of that red pink colour that I airbrushed onto that would have turned orange. So there's some gradients that you can't achieve through airbrushing alone. So I find that if you want to achieve something like that, get it printed with Spoonflower Minky and then go in, and if it's dark colours then you can airbrush the colours on top of them without having them blend too much. So you can see I don't really have very much orange blending between those yellow and red colours except where I want it to be. So I hope you guys found this video useful. If you've bought all my video tutorials, you can go back and watch my Spyro airbrushing, and I go into a bit more texturing and scale detail when I made Spyro. Ignitus doesn't have as many textures. But I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, send me a private message and I'll do my best to answer them. Bye!